When describing Yosef in this week's Parsha, it begins actually, the description, in the second pasuk Beis. And it says, Ele toldot Yaakov Yosef, that these are the children or the offspring of Yaakov, and it begins with Yosef. He says, Bein Sheva Esrei, that he was 17 years old, okay, that he was a young guy, which Rashi implies that means that he was a little immature, even for his age, that he was a shepherd, just like the rest of his brothers, that he hung out with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Interesting that it leaves out Leah's sons. And that he spoke bad reports, or dibartem ra'a, to their fathers. So Rashi and a few other Meforshim asked the question, what were these bad reports that he was telling over to Yaakov? And he said that there are three things. One is that he called the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah slaves because their mothers were maidservants. And the reality is that the Torah itself even calls them slaves at some point in time, but Yaakov did take them on as being full-fledged wives. So Yosef didn't really appreciate that. And it was kind of in a way he thought that it was a mocking terminology to be calling them such when they end up, especially later on, having the same type of reward or inheritance as all of the other type of brothers. The second thing is that he thought that they were eating from a live animal, which is not only a law or halacha that Jews keep, but also non-Jews are also supposed to keep this law as well. However, the way that it's explained to say over what the brothers were actually doing was, I know this is going to be a little bit graphic, but if you were to, let's say, cut off the head of a chicken, the chicken would actually still walk around and the nerve and jump around because the nerve endings would still actually have electricity flowing through it. And so that is what Yosef saw. Not that they were eating literally from a live creature, but that they ate right after it was killed. And so the nerve endings were still firing. And that's why he saw twitching in a way. The third thing was this idea of sexual promiscuity, which basically means that he thought they were, sowing their wild oats, as you were. And in actuality, they were just doing business with women. But Yosef thought that they were taking it to a bigger extent. And these are things that he was very concerned about and thought that they weren't following the way that they were taught to perform and behave. And so he wanted to tell his father that these are the things that are going on, to kind of make it so that Yaakov knew what was happening, and maybe possibly to get them back on the right track through a rebuke of their father. And that's actually the reason why he ended up giving over those reports. When Yosef finally gets sold into slavery, it actually mentions that there are good spices being sold in the caravan. And Rashi picks up on this and says, that's kind of a weird detail to put in there. So what's it doing here? So Rashi explains that even how terrible of a situation it was with Yosef being sold into slavery, usually caravans would sell petrol or gas or really bad smelling situations. And this caravan, for some reason, was smelling very, very good smelling spices. And it was to kind of ease and make at least the trip a little less unpleasant than it already was for Yosef. There's a Musar book called Orcha Tzadikim that talks a lot about different types of midot, or character traits. One of those traits happens to deal with embarrassment. And it actually brings a portion of this week's Torah portion into the fold. And it talks about how Tamar had totally the opportunity to say that Yehuda was the guy who impregnated me. He's the one who got me pregnant in the first place. So why am I getting punished? If anything, he should also be getting punished as well. And it's very interesting that she specifically doesn't go the straight route. And instead she just says, here are the things that the guy who impregnated me gave me. his signet ring, his cloak, and his staff, which were very distinctive things. It was very, very clear to Yehuda when he saw it that it was his. So the question ends up being, why didn't she just explicitly say it right out and instead just giving these things? The idea was that we try not to embarrass people in public. Because, as Orchot Tzadikim says, embarrassing a person is just like killing them. And actually, Rashi discusses this as well. And a big reason why we can see this is because when a person gets embarrassed, they turn white, as if all the blood runs out of them, right? Blood is kind of the important to live. So the idea is that embarrassing a person in public is the same as killing them. And Tamar didn't want to have that bloodshed on her hands. And so instead, she went in a roundabout way to explain her point. You ever heard a bunch of Jews who constantly say, Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem? Well, there's actually something to that. It's very interesting in this week's Parsha, where Potiphar, the master of Yosef, it talks about how he even knew that God was constantly with Yosef. And Rashi asks the question, how does Potiphar know that that's the case? And it was because Yosef was constantly saying things like Baruch Hashem and saying that all of the success that he always had came from God. And he would always bring anything that he did, which, by the way, Yosef was extremely successful in Egypt being a slave. He rose through the ranks extremely quickly, and anything that he touched, he was able to sell very quickly and for an exorbitant amount of money that Potiphar ended up putting him in second command. And so the reason why is because God was constantly with him, and he would always bring it back to God and say that this was really God's success, that Hashem is the one giving me the ability to be successful. And so too, we should do the same. At the end of the Parsha, Yosef finally gets to say goodbye to his best friend, the butler. And the butler, right before he leaves, Yosef says to him, please remember me and do not forget me. So there's actually a double wording there. And actually, there's a big complication here that we see, which is very fascinating because later on, actually, the butler does forget him, or basically maybe even specifically doesn't mention him unless it's good for him. And we end up also seeing that God really ended up making him forget, because it seems as if Yosef was putting too much emunah or belief or trust in the idea that someone other than Hashem was going to get him out of jail. And so because of this, he actually spent 2 more years in jail because it didn't seem like he was perfected in the emunah or bitachon in Hashem.